Good afternoon. My name is and I'm also one of the members of the advisory board for Brain Futures. It's really a pleasure to be here. I wish I had Jack pictures. I have a dog named Jack. I'm here today to introduce Dr. Gazzaley. Dr. Gazzaley is the professor at the University of California, San Diego, founding director of Neuroscape. He's going to be talking with you today to follow up on our last speaker on a book that recently came out called The Distracted Mind, Ancient Brains in a High-Tech World. And we'll be talking quite a bit with us about multitasking, understanding how our brains are able or not able to switch between tasks, and also to talk a bit about the distractions of our devices and how they really collide with our goals. He's also going to give us some practical advice on how to live better in a high-tech world without giving up our devices, which we are clearly obsessed with. So with that, please welcome Dr. Gazzaley.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for hanging in there. I know your brains are getting tired. I don't have any, yeah, that's good. Okay. Sounds good. I know your brains are getting tired, so we're going to keep this light. It's on a briefer side. You might be wondering, my title slide's not up, but you heard the title of the talk, why we're talking about ancient brains in a conference about brain futures, and why we're talking about the challenges of technology, where we have an expo full of the cutting-edge technology. And it's a good question. I think it's really critical that we pause. This is a pausing moment, and recognizing these aspects of our brains and how we interact with technology if we want to move forward responsibly and effectively. But this talk will have a pivot where we also discuss how technology can be used to overcome some of these challenges. Before we trash the brain, let's talk about some of the amazing aspects of it, right? Our 100 billion neurons and hundreds of trillions of connections enable us to process information and interpret our complex worlds within a tenth of a second, storing 1 billion bits of information, 50 times the info in the Library of Congress across our lives, and connecting rapidly events across decades. Right? So we have this tremendous ability to process and store information that really makes us wonder what happens when it collides with this, right? This world that we live in. And I don't have to explain to you, you're all aware that the last several decades have seen an explosion in the devices and the software that deliver information to us. I would say right now, our time is best described as the information age. And it's not just the devices and the software that's so remarkable. Matter of fact, I would say that's the least interesting story. The most interesting story is how we use it. And we've already just heard a little bit about that, but we know that data shows that 95% of people report multitasking with devices every day. On average, a third of the day. If you're a young person, it could be up to 7 devices at a time. And I won't go into all the stats, but it goes on, and it's mind-boggling in many ways. But I find even more interesting than how we use it is where and when we use it. So we know that technology has really invaded every aspect of our lives. It's in our classrooms, our restaurants. It's in our bedrooms, our bathrooms. It goes on vacation with us. And accompanying that has been a shift of expectations to 24/7 availability and productivity. And this has really caused a profound shift in how we interact with each other, our environment, and ourselves. And sometimes it's comical, other times it's life-threatening. But it really begs the question, what's going on here, right? What's going on in here to lead to all of this? And so scientists, my laboratory included, have been studying these processes that we call cognitive control. And these are the abilities that enable us to interact with our complicated world around us, our environment, based on our goals. And I'd put this into 3 different categories. The first is attention. How we direct our limited mental resources, where and when we want them in space and time. Also, how do we hold information in mind for short periods of time to cover these gaps that happen all the time? There's not long-term memory, it's just online working memory. And the other is what we call goal management. As best as possible, how do we multitask or task switch when we have multiple goals, which we frequently do? Now, as impressive as these abilities are, and they are impressive, without them you would not be able to engage or enact any of your goals. What we've learned over the last several decades of research, both in animals and in humans, is that they have these very fundamental limitations. Interestingly enough, the limitations in our cognitive control are not very different from other animals. You see them even in laboratory rats and certainly monkeys. This is why I use the phrase ancient brains in a high-tech world, right? We have these fundamental limitations. Our attention, although we can focus it to some degree, we're still subject to distraction. We don't have the ability to cast it out broadly and distribute it like throwing a net out into the ocean. Our working memory has defined limitations both on the capacity and the fidelity, right? So it's not the same as perceiving information in real time. And goal management. A tremendous amount of data shows that we suffer a deficit in performance every time we switch between tasks or try to engage in more than one task. As a matter of fact, what many of you probably realize now is that when you are engaged in more than one attention-demanding task, you're not really simultaneously processing, but you're switching between networks. And with each switch, there's a degradation in the resolution of that information and a decrement in the quality of your performance. And then there are our goal-setting abilities. I would say that goal-setting abilities are really the pinnacle of the human brain. We set these long, time-delayed goals that are interwoven with other goals and other people's goals. This is something that other animals don't really do. And these goal-setting abilities at this very high level then collide headfirst with these fundamental limitations in our cognitive control. And I'd say this is really sort of the crux of the issue. There is a conflict between what we want to do and what we're actually capable of doing. And this generates what we refer to as interference. This is not caused by technology, right? We've always had this interference. This conflict has always existed. But I'd say technology, because of the unprecedented exposure to information now, and not just information that we reach out for, but information that reaches out for us, right? That familiar buzz in your pocket when your device wants your attention has really aggravated this interference. And across multiple studies, both in the psychology literature as well as the cognitive neuroscience literature, you see that there's a degradation across all these aspects of cognition, how we perceive the world and make decisions, memory both in the short term and the long term, as well as emotional regulation, all caused by interference, and seems to be escalating, probably because of technology and the challenge that it causes in terms of the disconnect between our goals and our limitations. The other thing that's now becoming obvious is that these deficits in cognition, which are usually measured in the laboratory, then cascade into behavioral deficits that we see in real life. And so we could spend an hour going through these. Safety, the most obvious, which I already showed you a picture of, is using mobile devices in the car, but many others. Sleep, more and more data showing the use of devices in the evening, and especially in young people, causes many ramifications in terms of cognition, impact on relationships. Even seeing a cell phone, not yours, but on a neighboring table, degrades the empathy and connection you might be having with the person you're talking to. And then both education, classroom studying in young people, as well as the workplace, where the impact is rated in the billions of dollars over the world annually, we see a degradation and the impact of interference. So this is why someone picks up a book called The Distracted Mind in the first place. Sometimes it's obvious to you, other times it's not. You see it in other people. But this is the sort of the landscape of what we're starting to realize is the core of the distracted mind, and a very real challenge of modern technology, and one that's only likely going to get more complicated. Let's sort of switch over a little bit and talk about how do we manage it, right? So there's a ton of data about what I just described, so you just have to trust that for now, and you could certainly read deeper on all those issues. But how do we take control? I'd say there's really two pathways to gaining control over our distracted minds. The first is modifying our behavior, walking a different path that allows you to have more control. And the other is actually enhancing our cognition. Maybe not in a terrifying way like this picture, which I just happen to love, but in a more charming way than that. So let's talk for a moment about modifying behavior. Modifying behavior is incredibly challenging. Even when we know that our behaviors might be negative, smoking, sun exposure, diet, people still engage in behaviors. So I think it's important to go deeper and understand where these behaviors come from. I would say one way of thinking about it is that in many ways we're not very different than other animals, like squirrels. There is evidence to suggest that us primates have co-opted these ancient reward systems that drove other animals to forage for food for survival to drive us to forage for information, not necessarily even for survival. And you could see dopamine system activated in monkeys and experiments in similar ways to information rewards as they are to food and juice rewards. And if that's true, if at our core we're really information-seeking creatures, then we should be able to use models, foraging models, that guide other behaviors of animals to take in food, to help describe our behavior and hopefully change it. And so in the book, we don't have enough time, there's a brief talk to go into the details of this model, but essentially the marginal value theorem is an optimal foraging model that has been used to describe the foraging behaviors of animals that seek food in patchy environments, like a squirrel in a tree. And I'd say that we engage in seeking information in patchy environments, like a website or your iPhone. If you break down the different forces that drive an animal to forage, you could find similar factors that drive us and how technology might aggravate them. Once you understand that, you now have a framework for behavioral change. And so I'm not going to go into all the details of these, but I do want to point out some of the conclusions from that. The first thing that I think is critical for change, although not sufficient, but necessary, is awareness, is understanding the strengths of your brain, but also the limitations, and how it is aggravated by technology, how you are distracted by bottom-up forces that are very powerful, that pull you away from your top-down goals, and all those limitations in cognitive control that I described to you. Once you have that awareness, then I would say there are three things that you can manage. All of them are described in the marginal value theorem adoption towards technology, which is described in the book. The first is accessibility, limiting accessibility of technology so that it's not always so easy to get to the next information patch. The other two are very powerful, and you probably recognize it in yourself. You could do simple experiments to show that it's there, is the increased tendency to become bored very rapidly, even more powerful in younger people, and anxiety. This is the anxiety and boredom that occurs when you try to do one thing at a time. The anxiety could be FOMO. Is everyone familiar with FOMO? FOMO is fear of missing out. But it could also be performance anxiety, that you feel like you're not working hard enough unless you are doing multiple things. And this will accumulate rapidly. You could try an experiment where you actually try to do one thing at a time and not switch over to your email or text message or have a conversation while you're checking your email. Actually do one thing and you will feel the forces here. And so I'm not going to go through all the details of how you could gain control over these. One thing that I'd suggest is that this doesn't mean that it's always bad to multitask or that technology is evil. It just means that you can make informed decisions about how you engage in technology in a healthier way. So for example, and it's easier for me to tell you what I do. I'm not really a self-help guru, but what I do is I decide I'm going to engage in multitasking for an hour, let's say 10 to 11 in the morning, because it's more fun. It has a higher novelty load. It's easier to do some things that would just be impossible to do once at a time. But none of those are critical in terms of time sensitivity or in terms of demanding the highest quality. And then from 11 to noon, one thing. Now, when you try to do that, it's almost impossible. Maybe we had that ability one time, but most of us, including myself, have really lost it. I would say give yourself a 5-minute period of doing one thing and then take a break. Now that break should not be Facebook or email because that will be the end of what you were doing. Studies show that it could take 20 minutes to return to what you're doing with a break of that nature. Light exercise, mindfulness and meditation practices, exposure to nature. These are better ways for a short break and then re-engage. Try to make it through the hour with those breaks, and then each day have a longer period of single tasking until you develop those skills. So that's a little bit on the behavioral side. What I spend more time on is thinking about approaches to actually improve cognition. And what I mean here is cognitive control. Can we overcome a lot of those limitations? And so I'm just going to put up what I think of as the landscape of approaches. There is evidence for every one of these that varies across the spectrum from largely anecdotal to reasonable, that these might help improve cognitive control and help alleviate the distracted mind. So these are approaches that are experiential, interacting with the environment or challenging your mind. We've already heard a lot about this, physical fitness, nutrition, stress, sleep. Lots of evidence there, especially with exercise, as you just heard about, in terms of helping cognitive control abilities. Pharmaceuticals, these are used largely to treat medical conditions like narcolepsy for modafinil, ADHD for Ritalin and Adderall, Alzheimer's disease for Aricept. They're not great, but they also work on cognitive control abilities across all of them. Neurofeedback. There's a lot of examples of that on the expo. We're still learning about how to use those type of feedback systems to improve cognitive control. And then, as you heard from Alvaro, there's approaches to stimulating the brain, both non-invasively as well as invasively, that can also help. I just want to use this as a pivoting point and again talk about technology. So I love technology. This is not meant in any way to say that technology is bad. And we're certainly not putting that genie back in the bottle. One of my friends, Jon Favreau, he's a writer, producer, Hollywood guy. We've done a couple of interviews together, and he says this. He says, I want to find the humanity in the technology. And I think it's a really critical statement, especially where we live in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, that this is a pivoting point right now where we could think about technology that we develop from this perspective. Right? It's not saying that you're not trying to have a profitable company. I understand the bottom line. But I think part of every conversation should be, does the technology degrade what makes us most human, or does it enhance it? And so how do we think about technology in this way? This is a very important point right now because we have this explosion of technologies that are going to challenge us even further, potentially. Right? So we have consumer-level virtual reality, augmented reality, motion capture, wearable physiological devices, and AI and other machine learning technologies, all of which are exploding into the consumer space over the next 5 years. Some of them are already here. How do we think about these to have a positive impact on the distracted mind? It's obviously the devil's in the details. It's complicated upon how you develop technologies like this in that way, but the basic foundational aspect of it is not so complicated. It's that technologies, including the ones you have in your pockets and these new ones, can be used to create experience. And as you've heard many times, experience is what drives our brain's plasticity. Right? It's not a controversial point that this is what happens. Right? It's the basis of all of learning. Therapy, education wouldn't exist in any way if this wasn't true. We know how strong this connection is. You could witness a single tragic event and detrimentally impact the function of your brain for the rest of your life through an experience, right? PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The challenge we have as scientists and technologists and others in this larger community is, how do we create or leverage existing technology, given the awareness of the challenges that it has created for us, to design technology that maximally harnesses our brain's plasticity through powerful experiences, and then to validate that those effects are having the positive outcomes that we hope they would. I would say this is a really high-level challenge, especially for people sitting here in this audience. How do we do that? I want to just give you one example. Some of you may have heard this story. I'm just going to give it very briefly, just show one data slide. Around 2008, I asked myself all the questions that I just put before you right now, and said, could we create a custom-designed video game just to induce an experience, but an experience in a closed-loop system that's adaptive to a person's performance, to show that we can improve cognitive control abilities, I already described those to you, in older adults. And for a decade, I published dozens of papers showing that all of these abilities decline as we get older. but also showing that there's common neural mechanisms through prefrontal cortical networks that activate across all of these abilities. And so the hypothesis was that if we put enough pressure on one aspect of cognitive control, goal management, specifically multitasking, we would engender improvement in attention and working memory. That's what we're always looking for, transfer outside of the specific domain of training. And so I teamed up with friends of mine that worked at LucasArts, and we built this game called Neuro Racer. In Neuro Racer, you multitask. You drive a car on a road trying to maintain your position, and at the same time, you have to respond as rapidly and accurately to these target signs like green circles. So you have a perceptual discrimination task and a visual motor tracking task that are both adaptively challenging you right at the edge of your ability. What we showed, in just a little bit of data, the red line means that you multitask perfectly. Right? That means that you do that driving test just as well when you do it alone compared to when you're doing the sign task at the same time. And what we find is that if you are a 20-year-old, and at least the 20-year-olds in San Francisco all believe they are multitasking masters. It's true. They believe they're perfect at it. They're practicing it every day. But they don't. They suffer 27% decrement in performance when they play a video game in this way. If we look across the lifespan, we could ask the question, do you just hold this ability at this level, just plateau your whole life, and then just plummet in one tragic day when you're 69 years old? No, you plummet every tragic year of your life, just like that. But we showed that if we give older adults, that's the end of the sad part of talk, we're turning it around now. If you give older adults, these are healthy 60 to 80-year-olds, rather arbitrarily defined, because you can see aging begins around 23 years old. If you give them a laptop and they play this multitasking version of Neuro Racer for 12 hours, 1 hour a day, 3 days a week for 4 weeks, and look at them a month later, you dramatically improve their ability to multitask on the game, even exceeding the level of 20-year-olds who played on a single visit. But most importantly, we confirmed the hypothesis. We improved untrained abilities in working memory for faces and a sustained attention vigilance task, very different from the training environment. And this was only true for the group that played the multitasking version of Neuro Racer. Another group of older adults who played the single tasking version of the same game didn't show any transfer in these abilities. It wasn't just playing a video game for a month. The active ingredient in this game, to borrow a term from the pharmaceutical industry, was the interference resolution that was required, the multitasking challenge. We published this at the end of 2013 in this journal, and really was, to us, a call to arms that we felt we had something here. This is not enough to give prescriptive advice. I don't tell anyone to go out and play Neuro Racer. But I feel like we have a signal that we're onto something, that we have converging evidence, and now we've replicated this twice, other labs have as well, that there is a way to push on these cognitive control abilities and improve them and lead to benefits outside of that domain. Real life benefits, that's even harder to document, and that's where we're heading now. In order to do that, I realized that we could not move it out into the large enough numbers and build a product inside an academic laboratory at UCSF. And so for that, I helped form a company called Akili with my friends from LucasArts and a healthcare venture group called PureTech Ventures in Boston. And Akili has now licensed the patent behind that technology, which is owned by UCSF, and has built a much better game, but built on that same premise of interference resolution. That game is called Project Evo. We quickly realized that if you want people to play a video game for an extended period of time in a deep, engaging way, especially young people when there's no violence in the game, you need to bring on high levels of art, music, and story. These assets are expensive and take a great deal of expertise. And so after years of game development on a single game, we now have this iPad game called Evo. The interesting thing is that you cannot download Evo. This is actually a very polarizing point. Maybe some of you are feeling that right now. There are many people that feel that it should be released immediately, even as Neuro Racer, that evidence is good enough, and it should be open source and available. But we've made the decision at Akili to take this through the highest level of regulatory approval as a diagnostic and therapeutic tool. And so there are multiple clinical trials going on around the country right now: autism, PTSD, anxiety, depression, traumatic brain injury, multiple sclerosis study just started. Some of these are diagnostic, like the Alzheimer's study, showing that this game could differentiate two groups of older adults that only differ based on amyloid on a PET scan. But the gameplay is sensitive because of the closed-loop adaptive algorithms that are used. The study that's raised the most attention, and I'm on a panel tomorrow and we'll talk about this in more detail, is a phase 3 FDA trial. So it's a trial that's been pre-submitted to the FDA to have this game approved as a treatment for children with ADHD. So this, if approved, would be the first non-drug treatment for ADHD, the first prescribable video game, at least that I'm aware of. And so that hopefully will be happening as soon as next year if the data is there. So that's the pathway of laboratory discovery to company formation, to productization, and then validation at the end so that we know what we're doing to help maybe the epitome of the distracted mind in a meaningful and a sustainable way. Meanwhile, my laboratory is now turned upside down. No one wants to do traditional experiments anymore when someone sitting next to you has first off, a Nature paper and a potential tool to help people. And so my laboratory turned into a center at UCSF called Neuroscape, where our mission is to bridge this gap that we see exists between technology and neuroscience to actually lead to positive benefits. One technology, I'm not going to be talking about the glass brain. We actually have a virtual reality demo of it out in the Expo Center. It's a combination, that's actually my glass brain, same with the VR one. It's a combination of MRI and EEG. And ultimately, this will be used to close the loop so that the video game is not just being driven based on performance, but based on what is happening inside your brain, a way of focusing the algorithms to help optimize just those abilities that most need to be improved. I'm not going to have time to talk to you about this today, but I just wanted to give you a quick look at what Neuroscape looks like. It's not your traditional neuroscience lab. We have 3 of these now, and we're actually helping build labs around the world to help move this concept of technology and neuroscience merger to the next level. I just want to give you a peek at 6 new games. Over the last 4 years, we've been working in multiple teams of game professionals with scientists to create games. All of them act on different aspects of cognitive control. They all take into consideration the targeting through mechanics in the game, the adaptivity through closed loop, and of course, art, music, and story, which we think is critical to lead to that immersion that helps improve brain function. They use many different types of technologies to help deliver them: virtual reality, motion capture. We have games that are paired with brain stimulation. So you've already heard a bit about brain stimulation. We show that we can increase the learning curve on a game by electrically stimulating the brain during gameplay. Will that lead to greater transfer? That's a question that we're pursuing now. Ultimately, the real impact is, in my mind, not going to be any of these games in isolation. I don't want to take the approach that we've seen in the pharmaceutical industry of creating thick silos around every single therapeutic. Rather, there'll be a customized collection of games, what I call neuro CrossFit training, which will be personalized and based on your abilities that are going to optimize those aspects of cognition that are most appropriate for you. We now have we've started 5 longitudinal trials on those games, and the rest will begin by the beginning of next year, and do the deepest dive possible into understanding how this type of interactive experience can improve cognitive control. So we record EEG, fMRI, stress testing. We do blood work looking at telomere length, hormones, inflammatory markers, sleep monitoring. Anything that could change and is plastic before and after experience we record to show that the tools that we're creating do have this meaningful and sustainable effect. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.